the warriors who refused to surrender to England for more than 400 years. Scottish Highlands, 12th century. North of a line drawn from Dumbarton on the western coast to Stonehaven on the northeastern shore, a society existed that bore almost no resemblance to anything south of it. Different language, different laws, different loyalties, and a relationship with warfare so deeply embedded in daily life that it shaped everything. How land was held, how disputes were settled, how children were raised, and how men died. They were the people of the Scottish Highlands, and for more than 4 centuries, no army sent against them could make them stop. The clan system that organized Highland life is documented in Scottish records back to at least the 12th century. A clan was a network of kinship and obligations centered on a chief, originally the head of a family, increasingly an inherited position. The chief administered justice, settled feuds, and in exchange held a single obligation above all others: protect his people. Every able-bodied man owed military service. This was not an army that assembled occasionally. It was a society that was permanently ready to fight. The terrain of the Highlands built the Highland warrior as surely as any formal training. Steep mountain passes, narrow glens, peat bogs, and rocky coastlines created fighters who were expert in ambush, guerrilla movement, and combat in restricted terrain, exactly the conditions that neutralized larger, better-equipped conventional armies. The weapons they carried reflected their environment. Heavy battle axes and the claymore, the two-handed great sword, from the Gaelic Claidheim Mór, meaning great sword, demanded raw physical strength in close quarters. The largest claymore on record, used by the Maxwell clan in the 15th century, weighs approximately 10 kilograms and measures over 1.5 meters. It is on display today at the National War Museum in Edinburgh. How did this mountain people, organized into rival clans that feuded across generations, become the most effective resistance fighters in British history? What made them so difficult to conquer and so impossible to permanently subdue? The answer begins with an English king who made a catastrophic mistake in 1296. Wallace rises. Scotland refuses English occupation completely. Berwick upon Tweed, March 1296. King Edward III of England, a man his own contemporaries called the Hammer of the Scots, sacked the Scottish town of Berwick in an act of deliberate, systematic brutality. The massacre was a message. After Berwick, Edward's army defeated the Scots at Dunbar. King John Balliol of Scotland was imprisoned in England. The Stone of Destiny, the sacred coronation stone of Scottish kings, was removed from Scone Abbey and transported to Westminster. Scotland was occupied. Edward expected submission. What he got was William Wallace. In June 1297, Wallace raised the standard of revolt. He and James Douglas planned a strike on Scone, seat of the English-appointed Justice of Scotland. The English official there, William de Ormsby, was forewarned and fled. The revolt spread rapidly across the country. Edward, occupied with affairs in France, sent Henry Percy and Robert Clifford north to resolve what he called the Scottish problem. In September 1297, at Stirling Bridge, Wallace and Andrew Murray executed one of the most tactically brilliant battles of the medieval era. They allowed the English vanguard to cross the narrow bridge before attacking. Catching the English forces divided between 2 banks of the River Forth, unable to reinforce each other. The English commander, the Earl of Surrey, was routed. A force that heavily outnumbered the Scots had been destroyed by terrain and timing. Wallace was appointed Guardian of Scotland. In July 1298, Edward I personally led an army, including a strong contingent of Welsh longbowmen, to Falkirk. The Scottish formations, schiltrons of pikemen, held against the cavalry but were broken by the archery. Wallace was defeated. He went into hiding, traveled to France seeking support from King Philip IV, and possibly journeyed to Rome to seek papal backing. In 1298, Wallace was captured, taken to London, and executed on August 23, 1305. He was hanged, disemboweled while still alive, beheaded, and quartered. His remains were sent to 4 different cities as a warning. Scotland appeared finally conquered. It would not stay that way. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. Robert the Bruce crowns himself, fights back alone. Greyfriars, Church, Dumfries, February 1306. Robert Bruce met his chief rival for the Scottish crown, John Comyn, inside a church to discuss resistance against Edward the Martyr. A confrontation followed. Comyn was killed at the altar, within weeks with the backing of Scottish bishops, who had defied Edward's authority. Bruce was crowned King of Scots at Scone on March 25th, 1306. Edward the Fire declared that Bruce's supporters would be given no quarter. The consequences were immediate and savage. 3 of Bruce's brothers, Neil, Thomas, and Alexander, were captured and hanged, drawn, and quartered. His wife, Queen Elizabeth, daughter Marjorie, and sisters were captured and imprisoned. Bruce was defeated at the Battle of Methven, weeks after his coronation, and driven from the Scottish mainland as an outlaw. He went into hiding. He spent months as a fugitive in the Western Islands and possibly on Rathlin Island off the Irish coast. His forces reduced to a handful of men, his country occupied, his family imprisoned, and a price on his head. What happened next is one of the most remarkable military recoveries in European history. Edward the Martyr died on July 7th, 1307. His son, Edward the Second, was a vastly inferior military commander. Bruce emerged from hiding. Scots rallied to him across the Highlands and Lowland. He began systematically recapturing English-held castles, not by conventional siege, but by speed and improvisation. Edinburgh Castle was taken by a small party that scaled the volcanic Castle Rock at night, going over battlements that defenders believed were unclimbable. Roxburgh Castle, in the Borders, fell to a similar surprise assault. By early 1314, the only castle of any significant consequence still in English hands was Stirling, the fortress that controlled the gateway between the Highlands and Lowlands, perched on a crag visible for miles in every direction. Edward II assembled the largest army ever sent to invade Scotland to relieve it. He was walking into a trap. Bannockburn, outnumbered Scots, crush England's greatest army. Stirling, June 23rd and 24th, 1314. King Edward II led an English army estimated between 14,000 and 20,000 men north to relieve Stirling Castle, which Robert the Bruce had under siege. Bruce's Scottish force numbered approximately 6,000, pikemen, some cavalry, and a small contingent of archers. The odds, by any conventional military calculation, were impossible. Bruce chose his ground carefully. He positioned his forces at the New Park, a wooded area south of Stirling Castle, with the Bannockburn, a stream that flowed through boggy ground, protecting his flanks and limiting the space available for English cavalry to maneuver. On the evening of June 23rd, in full view of both armies, an English knight named Sir Henry de Bohun spotted Bruce riding alone on a small gray pony, inspecting his lines before a battle. De Bohun couched his lance and charged. Bruce waited, then at the last moment stepped his pony sideways and rose in his stirrups, splitting de Bohun's helmet and skull with a single blow of his battle-axe. The impact broke the axe handle. Bruce returned to his commanders and apologized for breaking his axe. That night, a Scottish knight named Alexander Seton defected from the English camp and reported that English morale was broken. On June 24th, the Scottish schiltrons, compact formations of pikemen carrying 12-foot spears, advanced from the woods toward the English lines. The English cavalry charged and was broken on the spear formations. The English archers, who had broken Scottish formations at Falkirk 16 years earlier, could not find a clear field of fire. The English army, pressed into the boggy ground beside the Bannockburn, had no room to maneuver. It collapsed into chaos. English losses included 34 barons and knights and thousands of infantry. The Scots claimed to have lost only 2 knights. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328 formally recognized Scottish independence. The Highland Charge terrifies every army in Europe. Pass of Killiecrankie, Perthshire, July 27th, 1689. A government army of 3,500 soldiers under General Hugh Mackay held a defensive position in a narrow Highland pass. Above them, on the surrounding hillsides, 2,500 Highland warriors waited in complete silence for more than 2 hours. They were waiting for the sun to drop low enough in the western sky to shine directly into the eyes of the government soldiers below. At approximately 7 o'clock in the evening, with the light blinding the government line, the Highlanders charged downhill. Contemporary accounts describe what followed as lasting no more than 3 minutes, from the moment the Highlanders began running to the moment the government army broke and fled. Approximately 2,000 government soldiers were killed or wounded. Highland casualties numbered perhaps 600. The tactic that produced this result had been systematically developed over the previous 40 years. Alasdair mac Calla. MacDonald, who fought in the Scottish Civil Wars of the 1640s alongside the Marquess of Montrose, is credited with refining the Highland Charge into its mature form. The sequence was precise. Advance to within 50 meters of the enemy line, fire a single devastating volley of muskets and pistols at close range, throw down the guns, draw the basket-hilted broadsword, and run at full speed into contact before the enemy could reload. The psychological effect was as important as the physical impact. The charge aimed to force some soldiers in the opposing line to break ranks before contact, creating gaps that the Highlanders could pour through, rolling up the entire line from the inside. This happened at the Battle of Tippermuir in 1644, at Killiecrankie in 1689, and most dramatically at Prestonpans in 1745, where a government army was destroyed in less than 10 minutes. The Highland Charge was so effective that the British Army eventually adopted it, transforming it into the volley and bayonet charge that became standard across the empire. Bonnie Prince Charlie marches deep into England. Glenfinnan, Scottish Highlands, August 19, 1745. A young man of 24 years old raised a royal standard on the shore of Loch Shiel. He had arrived in Scotland 7 weeks earlier with exactly 7 companions on a single ship. His name was Charles Edward Stuart, grandson of the deposed King James VII of Scotland, claimant to the thrones of Great Britain and Ireland. The Highlanders who came to know him would call him Bonnie Prince Charlie. The British government called him the Young Pretender. Within weeks, clans from across the Highlands were rallying to his banner. By mid-September, he had taken Edinburgh without firing a shot. On September 21st, 1745, at Prestonpans east of Edinburgh, his Highland army, drawn principally from Clan Cameron, Clan Stuart, and Clan MacDonald, swept through the government forces of General Sir John Cope in less than 10 minutes. A local sympathizer had shown the Jacobites a path through the marshy ground, protecting Cope's position, allowing them to approach through thick morning mist. The artillery crews fled before they could fire. The cavalry scattered. Cope's entire army of approximately 2,000 men was shattered before most of them had the chance to engage. The government commander was not present at the battlefield, when his own army ceased to exist. The Jacobite army marched south into England. By December 1st, 1745, it had reached Derby, approximately 200 kilometers north of London. English Jacobite support had not materialized in the numbers the prince expected. His Scottish commanders, led by Lord George Murray, calculated that continuing south without reinforcement was military suicide. The army turned north. The retreat was orderly. At Falkirk on January 17, 1746, the Jacobites defeated the pursuing government army one final time. But the government was now sending reinforced, battle-hardened troops north. The Jacobite cause was converging on a single point: a flat, boggy moor 5 miles east of Inverness. Culloden. 60 minutes and 4 centuries of resistance. Drumossie Moor, 5 miles east of Inverness. April 16, 1746. The Jacobite army had spent the previous night attempting a surprise attack on the Duke of Cumberland's camp at Nairn, where government forces were celebrating the Duke's 25th birthday. The march through darkness had become disordered. Dawn came before they were in position. The attack was abandoned. The Highland warriors straggled back to Culloden Moor at first light, exhausted, hungry, and without sleep. Their commander, Charles Edward Stuart, was advised by Lord George Murray to withdraw to ground better suited for the Highland charge: steep, enclosed terrain, where artillery and disciplined musketry counted for less. Charles refused. He chose to make a defensive stand on Drumossie Moor, flat, open, boggy ground that gave every advantage to the government army, now advancing from the east. The Duke of Cumberland commanded approximately 8,000 well-rested, well-supplied professional soldiers. The Jacobites numbered around 5,000, an estimated 35% of their effective strength absent foraging for food. Cumberland's artillery opened fire. The Jacobite army, stationary and exposed on the open moor, had no cover and no effective counter-battery fire. Men began to fall without being able to reach the enemy. Without orders from the paralyzed Jacobite command, Clan McIntosh in the center of the line began to charge. Donald Cameron of Lochiel led the Camerons to join them. The charge was spontaneous, uncoordinated, and disorganized. Despite canister shot and sustained musket volleys, the charge reached and in places broke through the government front line. But mortar fire and flanking musketry from the deeply echeloned government forces killed those who had broken through. The others fell back. The retreat became a rout. Between 1,500 and 2,000 Jacobites died on the field. Government casualties numbered approximately 50. The battle lasted under 1 hour. It was the last pitched battle ever fought on British soil. England bans kilts, bagpipes, and Highland identity. Inverness, summer 1746. The Duke of Cumberland, who would carry the name Butcher Cumberland for the rest of his life, ordered systematic reprisals across the Highlands. Government troops burned villages, drove off cattle, and executed prisoners and wounded men where they lay. Contemporary accounts describe soldiers killing anyone suspected of Jacobite sympathy. Approximately 3,500 Jacobites were subsequently arrested, imprisoned, executed, or transported to penal colonies in the American colonies. The British government then passed legislation designed to make certain this could never happen again, not by improving military defenses, but by destroying the culture that had produced the resistance. The Dress Act of 1747 made it illegal for any man or boy in Scotland to wear Highland clothes, the belted plaid, the philibeg or small kilt, shoulder belts, or any part of what the law specifically called the Highland garb. The penalty for a first offense was 6 months' imprisonment. A second offense meant transportation overseas for 7 years. The law was enforced. A young man in Strathglass drowned attempting to swim a loch to avoid capture while wearing a plaid. A servant named Orinoco, working for MacLean of Duart on the Isle of Mull, was arrested for wearing Highland dress and imprisoned for 6 months. The Heritable Jurisdictions Act of 1746 abolished the hereditary powers of the clan chiefs, their ability to administer justice, raise troops, and govern their territories as small independent kingdoms within the larger realm. Chiefs were compensated financially, but stripped of the authority that had made the clan system function as a parallel political structure for 5 centuries. Jacobite estates were confiscated to the crown. Government-appointed commissioners introduced lowland agricultural methods, and Protestant ministers. The Dress Act was not repealed until 1782. By then, a generation had grown to adulthood that had never worn a kilt. The everyday connection to Highland dress had been systematically severed. And something far worse was already beginning. Landlords burn villages. Clearances empty the Highlands. Sutherland, Scotland, circa 1810. George Granville Levison Gower, who would become the first Duke of Sutherland, began a campaign of evictions across the county that would define what history calls the Highland clearances. His factor, Patrick Seller, oversaw the removal of thousands of families from interior glens to coastal strips of land inadequate for the mixed pastoral farming those families had practiced for generations. Seller's methods were direct. Homes were burned to prevent return. Families had hours to remove their possessions before the buildings were set alight. Those who moved to the coast were expected to survive by collecting kelp, a seaweed product with industrial uses, or by fishing on land and in waters they had no tradition of working. The Highland clearances were the forced evictions of inhabitants from the Scottish Highlands and Western Islands, beginning in the mid to late 18th century and continuing into the mid-19th century. Approximately 70,000 Highlanders and Islanders were removed from their ancestral lands over the course of 100 years. The primary stated motivation was economic. Sheep farming was more profitable than the small tenant farms that had sustained Highland communities, and landowners, many of whom had inherited or purchased estates from bankrupt Jacobite chiefs after Culloden, were determined to maximize returns. At the start of the 18th century, approximately 30% of Scots lived in the Highlands and Islands. By the turn of the 20th century, that figure had fallen to 8%. The period between 1825 and 1855 is considered the era of expulsion. In 1825, the Laird of Call paid to relocate all but 50 of his tenants from the island of Rum to Cape Breton in Nova Scotia, Canada. He then leased the entire island to a single sheep farmer. Women led the resistance when it came, standing between eviction officers and the homes behind them, destroying eviction notices, sending written threats to imported lowland shepherds. More than 1,500 sheep were stolen from the Sutherland estate in a single year in the early 19th century. The Crofters Holdings Act of 1886 legally eliminated future evictions. It arrived decades too late for tens of thousands of families already gone. Scattered worldwide, Highlanders keep Scotland alive forever. Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, Canada, 19th century. Gaelic was spoken on the streets. Highland games were held each summer. The music of the bagpipes, the instrument the British Parliament had classified as a weapon of war in 1746, was played openly and passed to children who had never seen Scotland. The families who had been driven from the glens of Sutherland and Inverness and Ross-shire had carried their language, their music, their clan identities, and their memory across the Atlantic, and they had refused to put them down. The Scottish Highland diaspora is one of the largest proportional diasporas of any nation in the world. Descendants of Highland families are found in mass concentrations across Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. The Carolinas received substantial waves of Highland immigrants in the 18th and 19th centuries. Nova Scotia, whose name means New Scotland in Latin, became one of the most concentrated centers of Gaelic-speaking Highland culture outside Scotland itself. The Highland regiments that had once fought against the British Crown became, after Culloden, the Crown's most feared soldiers. The Black Watch, today the 1st Battalion, Royal Regiment of Scotland, traces its lineage to 1742 and has served in every major British military campaign from Fontenoy to Afghanistan. The same warriors Britain tried to erase became the instrument of British imperial expansion across 4 continents. The Culloden battlefield, managed by the National Trust for Scotland approximately 5 miles east of Inverness, receives visitors from around the world every year, many of them descendants of the diaspora, arriving from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. They bring flowers. They bring soil from the countries where their families eventually settled. They leave them on the clan grave markers that still stand on the moor, where their ancestors fell on April 16th, 1746. Scottish Gaelic is today spoken by fewer than 60,000 people, concentrated primarily in the Outer Hebrides. Revitalization efforts continue through bilingual schools and broadcast media. The Highland population fell from 30% of all Scots in 1700 to 8% by 1900. The Scottish Highlands today are largely empty. Even the sheep farms that replaced the cleared communities have mostly gone. But in Cape Breton and Otago and Appalachia and 1,000 other places, the people who were driven out kept everything that mattered.